Welcome to the second session of the Goldenberg Destiny Project. So in the last session, we spoke about where you find world history. And we presented the idea that world history takes place in that part of the world which I call the imperial quadrant. The part of the world that projects its power to the rest of the world. Hard power military, soft power cultural, it projects its power to the rest of the world. And I presented two questions. One question was, when was the best time in the history of the world? And the second question was a question about a rope, which I'm going to address both of these questions today. So the first question, when was the best time in the history of the world? So I want to read something to you. This was written by Edward Gibbon. Edward Gibbon was a historian, a very great historian. He wrote a book called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Classic book. It was in the 1700s. I say a book, it's probably like 8 volumes. I didn't read the whole thing. I read an abridged version. And he was a anti-Christian, anti-organized religion. He was like a Roman pagan style. So this is what he writes. If a man were called to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would, without hesitation, name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus. Domitian was a Roman emperor. It was Vespasian who was the one who invaded Israel, and there was Titus who replaced him when Vespasian went and became the emperor. So Titus took over and he completed the siege and destruction of Jerusalem. And when Titus died, his brother replaced him. His brother was Domitian. Domitian died in 96. Commodus became emperor in 180. So we're talking about the years from 96 in the Common Era till 180 of the Common Era. Okay, so what happened during this time? So Gibbon writes, the vast extent of the Roman Empire was governed by absolute power under the guidance of virtue and wisdom. The armies were restrained by the gentle hand of 4 successive emperors whose character and authority commanded involuntary respect. The forms of the civil administration were carefully preserved by Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and the Antonines, who delighted in the image of liberty and were pleased to consider themselves as accountable ministers of the laws. So this is how his opinion of what is the best time in the history of the world, the 2nd century of the Common Era. Now, as far as we're concerned, it was the worst. I mean, we're meaning the Jewish people. So during this century, Hadrian, on the ruins of Jerusalem, put in a shrine to the Roman god Jupiter. And this led to and he renamed the city Aeolia Capitolina. And this led to the revolt, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which we will talk about when the time comes. And then the response to the rebellion, the Romans crushed the rebellion. And then they outlawed the practice of the Jewish religion. It's called, in Jewish history, it's called the Gzeres Hashmad, the decree of destruction of the religion. And they did not allow its practice, they did not allow its study. And then they salted the land, and they deported the rest of the Jewish population, except for very few. They deported the Jewish population from Eretz Yisrael, from Israel, and the destruction of the temple in the 1st century was the beginning, but the 2nd century was the completion and total destruction of the Jewish state, the Jewish Commonwealth, everything. This, I would say, is the worst of times. So Gibbon sees this as the best of times because he is a Roman. He was British, but he was a spiritual descendant of the Romans. He sees it as the best of times. we see it as the worst of times, which shows you the importance of perspective. That who's right? Is he right or are we right? It's not possible to say who's right, because he sees it one way, we see it the other way, and both of these are valid, because history is driven by perspective. So his perspective drives history, our perspective drives history, they clash, things happen, but there's no such thing as an objective correct and objective wrong. For him, this was the best time, for us, it was the worst time. I want to give you like an analogy. Let's look at the world as a valley, and it has a floor and it has hillsides, and there are many houses in this valley, and you live in a house, and you look outside and you see many other houses. Some are close to you, some are up on the hillsides. You see all these houses, and you see what's going on in this valley. There's a lot of action in the streets, and all kinds of things are happening. Now, I live in one of these houses, and if I was to write about what's going on outside in the streets, it's valid. I could write the way I see it. But how about what's happening inside, in my house? Then, so I understand my house. I share the experiences, the ideology, the aspirations, the beliefs. I live in this house, and I really understand it. Now, let's say I was to go out, and I want to write about, so that's a very valid history. I call that an endo-history, a history from inside. Now, let's say I go out, and I go to another house, and I want to write about that house. And I look into the window, and I see what's going on. Or even if I go inside and visit, or even if I go inside for a little while, I'm still not going to get it. I'm not going to know exactly what is the Geist, what is the spirit, what is the feeling in that house, because I don't live there. And even if I decide to move there and live there for a long time, I'm probably never going to get it completely as the people who are born and grew up in that house. So now, if I write a history of that house, is it wrong? It's not wrong. It reflects the way I look at that house from my perspective. That's what it is. Is it wrong? It's not wrong. It's not right. It's what it is. There's a historian called Paul Johnson who wrote a history of the Jewish people. He's a British, not Jewish person, and he wrote a history of the Jewish people, and I recommend it. I recommend it on my website, RabbiReinman.com. And it's a good book. It's a very good book. But it's still written from an outside perspective. It's an exo-history. It's a person on the outside looking in, and he doesn't completely get it. But it's valuable. This is how, like a good non-Jew who is favorably disposed towards the Jewish people, this is how he sees the Jewish people. And it's valuable. So, what I want to say is that perspective is what drives history, and all perspectives are valid because all of them are real. This is what other people, how they look at us, that's their perspective. That's a reality, that's how they look at us, and everything goes into the equation of history. Now, this Destiny Project, and the book that I'm writing together with Destiny Project, is being written from the perspective of one house. Which house? So, in the valley, there is a house called America, which is a big house, America. But big houses could have in them smaller houses, and have other houses maybe overlap. In the house of America, there's a Jewish house. And Jewish house could be even include people outside America. But there's a Jewish American house, which brings together Jewish and American, and this is the house Jewish American. Now, in the Jewish American, there are many, 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 many different houses. There are Ashkenazim and Sfaradim and Hasidim and Lubavitchers and Yeshivish and Litvaks and the Orthodox and Ultra-Orthodox and Modern Orthodox and Reform and Conservative and Restructuralists. All of these are in this Jewish house. I'm writing this book and presenting this Destiny Project from the perspective of a house called the House of Classical Judaism. What is Classical Judaism? We'll explain it much more in the future sessions, but I just want to give it in a nutshell. What is Classical Judaism? Classical Judaism has three fundamental beliefs. The first belief is that God exists. It's a fact God exists. That's one. The second belief is the divine origin of the Torah. The Torah was given to us by God. It is obligatory. It cannot be changed or canceled or anything. That's the second belief. The third belief is that what defines Jewish people is membership in the covenant that God formed together with Avraham. These are the three fundamental beliefs that define classical Judaism. Any of these smaller houses of Judaism that fit under this umbrella, I am trying to represent them. Now, I'm not going to, there are many, many different flavors. I'm not going to go into all that. I want to present a view of history, a view of what happens in the imperial quadrant from the perspective of the house of classical Judaism. Now, I want to come now to the last question. Okay, so let me repeat the question. You take a rope, and the equator is 25,000 miles long, which is, I think, like 130 million feet. I'm not sure right now. I haven't have it in front of me. But pretty long. You take a long rope, and you stretch it all the way around the equator until it meets and fits exactly. Now, we add 60 feet to one end of the rope. Now that we put the new ends together. So now it's not going to be so snug. It's going to be a little bit loose. And assuming there's no gravity, it will float off the ground uniformly all the way around the world. How much off the ground will it be? That was the question. And now I gave you time to think about it and come up with ideas. I asked some people what they thought, and most people told me it's like a micrometer, a millimeter, or a couple of people got the answer right, because I gave a hint. But very, very, very infinitesimal. But the answer is, it's 10 feet off the ground all the way around the world. And when I tell them that, they said, what? 10 feet off the ground? How could that be? How could that be? All the way around the world, 10 feet off the ground? It's mind-boggling. How could that be? But I'll show it to you mathematically. It's very simple. Basic geometry is that the circumference is the formula for a circumference of that means the outer rim of the circle, is 2 pi r. 2 times pi times the radius. The radius is the line going from the center of the circle to the rim. Pi is 3.14. So for the purposes of our riddle, we're going to round it off to 3. As the Gemara, the Talmud does, uses 3 as a round number. So it's 2 times 3 times the radius equals the circumference. 6 times the radius. So the length of the circumference of a circle is 6 times the length of the radius from the center to the rim, to the circumference, 6 times that. Now, the equator is the circumference of the Earth, right? The radius is the line going from the center of the Earth to the surface. Now, if you increase the ratio of the circumference to the radius is 6:1. So if you increase the circumference by 60, you increase the radius by 10. And that's why I said I had 60 feet, not 100 feet. That was my hint. Because I wanted to make it easy. You should work with simple numbers. So I added 60 feet. And by adding 60 feet to the circumference, we're adding 10 feet to the radius. Now, it is pretty mind-boggling. How could it be? 10 feet off the ground, all the way around the world? But it is. So how can you explain that? The explanation is, again, a different kind of perspective. If you are in a spaceship looking at the world, the entirety of the world, those 10 feet would disappear. You would see nothing. It would really be as if there's nothing. But if you go in microscopically to every single point, you will see that is 10 feet. The distance from an electron to the proton in an atom, relative to the size of the proton, is tremendous. But you can't even see an atom. You can't see it. So, but if you want to get in microscopically with some kind of electron microscope, and you want to see the measurement, you're going to see it's pretty far. So that's the same thing over here. And if you look at it globally, then 10 feet is like, it's inconsequential, it's nothing. But if you look at it specifically, so when you're dealing with history, it's the same thing. If you want to deal with world history, there's something called the forest and the trees. Sometimes, if you want to see the forest, if there are too many trees, you don't see the forest. So, if you are doing a history of, let's say, New Jersey, then you really want to add a lot of detail, because it's going to, more detail adds a lot of richness to your subject. But if you want to do a history of the world, and you're going to do a lot of detail, then it's just going to bog down the whole enterprise, and you're not going to get the picture. So really what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do the history of the world in broad strokes. And I'm going to have recommended readings. Anybody wants to get the deeper dive into any parts of the history, if you want to do a deep dive into Vilna, Vilna in Lithuania, what was very important in Jewish history, and I'm going to treat it, I'm going to speak about the importance of it, but I'm not going to get into every rabbi that was there and when it was established and so forth, because that's just going to take away from the broader picture. So again, this is so the point of this session is to establish that we are going to be doing everything from the perspective. I'm not saying that other perspectives are not valid. I'm not doing that. This presentation will be from the perspective of the House of Classical Judaism, and it will be global rather than specific and local. Thank you very much. I'm happy you came here, and I hope to see you again next session. Thank you.